Chapter 2. Accident. Maha returned to fidgeting with her spaghetti. She felt unprepared to address that question, ready to change the subject as usual. However, she noticed Adam curiously staring at her from the corner of her eye. Maha knew that the time had come, as her children were growing older, and she would have to provide some form of explanation. She took a deep breath. It's complicated. Your grandmother loves you both very much. The truth is, she has not visited because I asked her not to. So I guess she is finally respecting my wishes. Adam leaned forward and whispered, What happened? It's Lake's birthday. Can we please talk about this later? Maha begged, her eyes pleading with Adam to end the conversation. Adam opened his mouth in protest, but quickly forgot as the workers carried out a huge ice cream sundae in a mini clown car, a special birthday treat Fanny's Kitchen was famous for providing. The giant dessert was complete with one burning candle and 4 spoons. The waitresses clapped as they walked and started singing, getting the whole restaurant to join them in singing Happy Birthday to Little Lake. Lake perked up in her seat as she listened to the whole place break out in applause. Smiling from ear to ear, she closed her big brown eyes, made a wish, and blew out the candle. Everyone dug into the sweet, cold treat, big enough to feed 10. Maha wiped her mouth with a napkin, and relief flooded her at being let off the hook. That was until Lake, with ice cream, cherries, and chocolate syrup, filling her mouth, gurgled. What happened with Grandma? Maha frowned and realized that the questions weren't going away anytime soon. She looked to Darren for help, hoping he would distract the kids, but he just glanced down, staring at the yellow table. Reluctantly, Maha slouched into her seat and began to tell her story. As you know, your father and I grew up in the same small town in North Dakota. We met at school when we were both just 5 years old. Maha relaxed a little, a smile evident on her face as she recalled the fond memory. We have been best friends ever since. Darren jumped in. I knew your mom was my soulmate, so I asked her to marry me at her high school graduation ceremony. Maha laughed at her husband and continued. Of course, my mother objected. She raised me all by herself, but I guess she wasn't ready to let me go. But I had no doubts that Darren was my one true love, and besides, I wasn't about to accept marital advice from my mother. I felt like if she couldn't make her marriage work, then what gave her the right to comment on mine? Maha's parents had split years earlier when she was still very young. However, she still vividly remembered every detail of the day her dad left. It was Taco Tuesday, and she could still picture herself in the kitchen, laughing and cooking with her mother, the storm outside being the least of her worries. She remembered carefully chopping vegetables when her dad rushed in, panicked, anxiously ushering them down to the basement. Maha had closed her eyes and squeezed her mother's hand tight as they huddled together while 4 or 5 tornadoes whipped through the ravaged little town. The series of tornadoes would end up being the most devastating disaster the town had ever seen, leaving mountain in shambles in its quake. Maha would always remember it as the first sign of her life falling apart. She had been setting up a game of Monopoly, carefully counting out money and sorting cards. She was so focused on her task at hand that she paid little attention to her parents' intense conversation, their hushed voices and gestures going unnoticed. Then suddenly, all Maha could remember was her father sprinting up the stairs and her mother screaming, tears rolling down her cheeks as she cried, "Don't go!" But he did go. Her father had grabbed the few items from his room and must have brewed himself a pot of coffee. Maha distinctly recalled him walking back to the basement, holding a suitcase in one hand and a coffee thermos in the other. He set down his suitcase and kissed Maha on her forehead, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, He bent down and whispered, "This is a dangerous world. Your mother is going to keep you safe. I love you, and I'm sorry." He kissed her again and disappeared back up the stairs, taking the suitcase, his thermos, and part of Maha's heart with him. As her father swung open the front door, Maha remembered thinking that she heard the loud sound of a train's whistle, the sharp, piercing noise still echoing in her brain. She remembered being puzzled at the sound because the nearest train station hadn't even been within 50 miles. Maha never saw her father again. Maha blinked, bringing herself back to the present, and continued, "My father left both of us when I was very young. Although I believe my mother knows where he went, she has never disclosed his whereabouts, only briefly mentioning a place down south whenever I asked. I quickly grew tired of the same response, given that everywhere was down south, since if I stood facing north and threw a rock, I could hit Canada. In my mother's eyes, it was like he never existed. She reverted our last names to her birth name, refused to discuss my father, and the awaited explanation never came. Understandably, she was devastated by his sudden departure, never quite recovered, but I was still just a kid, and I needed answers. I needed help. Over time, this drove a wedge into our relationship, and it only grew deeper with each passing year." Darren reached out and held his wife's hand, silently offering her comfort. Adam and Lake looked at the floor, feeling remorseful for asking but also curious, having never heard about their mother's childhood. Maha shook herself, snapping out of her trance, and tried to wrap up. "To finish, my mother was extremely overprotective of me, always wanting to know where I was and who I was with. She never allowed me to venture too far into the world, try new things, or make different friends. She would always say, 'The world is a dangerous place, filled with perilous things that are hidden from our view.' I always thought things would change when I got married. We all lived in my mother's house for about 2 years. Maha smiled again and looked at her oldest. That was when we had Adam. I was an adult. I was married. I had a family of my own, yet my mother only tried harder to control our lives." Darren interjected. "I was not accustomed to living with such an overbearing person, and your grandmother and I never seemed to see eye to eye, no matter the circumstance. I was young, but I was trying to be an adult, a husband and a father. It was difficult. We had many clashes, usually resulting from her never-ending need to scare and control us with her doomsday scenarios. Then one day, I was finally at my wit's end. I threatened to take my family and leave, planning to go so far away from her that she wouldn't be able to control us anymore, and we could finally live our lives." Maha resumed. "I loved your dad very much and wanted to support him. So we packed up the car and started driving. We didn't have a plan, just kept driving south and away from the cold weather in North Dakota. We drove pretty much all day, tired but excited for our new life to start. Just as the needle on the gas gauge sank below E, wondering how we were going to afford another tank, we saw it. The massive, white, 200-foot-tall cross just off the side of the highway. Neither your dad nor I were particularly religious, but it seemed like it was calling to us, and we decided to follow it, leading into a place called Effingham. As we entered the town, tired and worn from the drive, we saw a sign that read, "The Crossroads of Opportunity." We thought it was the perfect sign to see at that specific time. We needed an opportunity. We found an extremely cheap motel to sleep in, and the next day your father found temporary work as a dishwasher. Effingham was far enough away from my mother for us to feel comfortable, and it was a fresh start for us. So We made a home here. And 3 years later, Lakey was born. Adam and Lake didn't know much outside their home. A small house in a secluded wooded area about 20 minutes outside of the city limits. Effingham was a small but bustling city in the top portion of southern Illinois, in the center of the state. Its population was somewhere around 12,000 people, filled with busy, hard-working individuals who enjoyed hot summers and pleasant winters. A comfortable silence settled over the family. They all ate the ice cream sundae quietly until every last drop was gone. Everyone had more than their fill, but Adam ate the lion's share. After eating all that ice cream, Lake's energy had been reinforced with sugar. She excitedly tapped her dad on the shoulder and extended her hand. Franny's had a back room with about 10 old arcade games that still ran on quarters, and Lake never let anyone forget. Darren reached into his pockets, and Maha dug through her purse, scrambling for change until they came up with a whole $4. Maha placed 8 quarters in each kid's hand, and they ran over to the back room, almost tripping in their haste. After they left, Maha and Darren sighed and comfortably relaxed in the booth, trying to digest their meals and desserts. Adam and Lake had, for the time being, forgotten about their grandparents, and instead were focusing on trying all the games in the arcade. Lake spread her money around, trying as many games as she could, while Adam spent his entire $2 playing Galaga. When Lake ran out of quarters, she sat on the floor, resting against the wall as she watched Adam destroy space aliens one by one. Eventually, the kids headed out of the back, as it had gotten late. Darren gathered all the gift bags and wrapping paper scraps, and they all walked out to their car. They loaded into their old, beat-up 2012 Ford Escort. Nowhere close to new, but every dent or scratch had a loving story behind it. It was complete with a faded paint job, absolutely zero luxury features, and only 3 working seatbelts. Even though Adam was the cautious one, he always let his sister get the working seatbelt. After he helped Lake buckle her seatbelt, Darren fired up the engine, and they started their 30-minute journey home, one they had traveled hundreds of times before. As they turned out of the city, the road turned dark and winding with dense forests on either side. It was uncomfortably hot, and there was a light fog rolling across the rural road. Darren was driving, enjoying his quiet time with the family, despite being tired from a grueling week of working 2 jobs. Maha was enjoying the wind flooding through the open windows, smiling and resting against the headrest after her long week. Then, over the wind, she could hear the slight tune of one of her favorite songs from her childhood, playing on the radio. She leaned forward and turned the volume up. Then she twisted slightly in her seat and swayed to the music, singing the lyrics she knew by heart to Christina Aguilera's Genie in a Bottle. Adam joined in and sang along during the familiar chorus. Lake, not knowing the words, was perfectly content fidgeting with her new necklace while she looked out the open rear passenger side window, openly admiring the full moon that she could just barely make out through the fog. The song ended, and Maha and Adam started singing the next one, a little less enthusiastic, but just as loud. Darren was also nodding along as he turned the car down another bend in the road. As the old Escort slowly made its way around, a figure suddenly appeared just ahead on the roadway. It was gray from head to toe and crouched down on all fours. Darren would have mistaken it for a coyote or fox, if not for its incredible size. For a second, he thought it was human. It appeared to have human arms and legs, but it couldn't have been human. He squinted closely, realizing it wasn't wearing any clothes, and the only thing he could make out in the dark and fog were its sharp, jagged teeth and bright yellow eyes, glistening in the dark and glowing back at the car. Darren slammed on the brakes, knowing he was either going to hit the creature or run off the road trying to avoid it. Maha, who had just turned around, screamed, "Watch out!" as Darren yanked the car to the left, just slightly missing the gray figure. As the car spun out of control, the tires screeched loudly, and Darren spun the steering wheel into the car's fishtail. It started to correct, but then overcorrected, sending them into a spin and pushing them off the road. The family careened into the woods and down a small embankment, the vehicle going dangerously fast downhill. Lake wailed loudly as she caught sight of the large oak tree, standing just a couple of feet away. Just before the Ford banged into the tree, Adam grabbed a hold of Lake and threw his body over hers.